Chapter 7. The History of British Rule in India. Throughout the last 30 years of his life, from 1918 to 1948, Mahatma Gandhi fought three major battles: the battle with himself, the battle with Indians, and the battle with Britain. From remote antiquity to modern times, India has been invaded 26 times. The British invasion was the last. Until the end of the 15th century, all of India's conquerors came overland and all, except Babur, approached through what is now Russian Turkestan, crossed the Hind to Kush where the passes are from 12,000 to 16,000 feet above sea level, and then filed through the narrow Khyber Pass to the Suleiman mountain range and the banks of the Indus and beyond. Semiramis, Queen of Assyria, sent an army into India via Turkestan 22 centuries before Christ. Cyrus of Persia repeated this performance in 530 BC. Northwest India remained under Persian domination. Indians probably fought the Greeks at Marathon until Alexander the Great of Macedon swept out of Greece at the head of an army of 40,000 men, quickly subdued Syria, Egypt and Palestine, defeated Persia at Arbela, marched to the Oxus and Samarkand and then, climbing the Hindu Kush, entered India in 326 BC. At the age of 30. After a 19-month stay, Alexander, a pupil of Aristotle, left for home, taking with him several Indian philosophers. He died 2 years later in Babylon. The Greeks, and subsequently the Romans, carried to the west the achievements of Indian science. The so-called Arabic numerals were invented in India. The zero is an Indian concept. An Indian brain likewise evolved the present worldwide system of numeral placement, the system whereby a 1 with a 4 after it is 14 and a 4 with a 1 after it is 41. Attracted by the wealth and mystery of India, more fabled conquerors, Genghis Khan, Tamerlan, Nader Shah and others, added their scratches to Indian history and withdrew with loot and lore. On July 8, 1497, 5 years after Columbus and 3 Spanish vessels discovered America, Vasco da Gama and 3 Portuguese ships, the largest of which displaced 150 tons, anchored off the southwest shore of India. Thus began the first seaborne invasion of India. The Papal Bulls of 1493 and an agreement with Spain gave Portugal, then a world power, a Catholic monopoly in Southeast Asia. That did not prevent the Dutch from establishing several lucrative trading posts in India early in the 16th century. The French followed a few years later. They sent home pepper, cinnamon and other spices. England hesitated to encroach on the formidable Portuguese. Instead, since they had wool to sell which torrid southern Asia did not need, the British searched for a northwest passage through North America and a northeast passage around northern Europe to the colder regions of China. But when this quest proved vain, England, emboldened by her victory over the Spanish Armada in July 1588, dared to defy Portugal, Spain's confederate, and dispatched her first expedition into the Indian Ocean in 1591. Despite the war with Spain and Portugal, other British expeditions followed. The peace signed with these nations increased the traffic and intensified the commercial competition. An East India Company was formed in London in 1600. Its renewed charter of 1609 gave it a British trade monopoly in Asia unlimited in time and space. War greased the wheels of business. The Dutch, vigorous and aggressive and supported by all the military might of the homeland, took the offensive against Portuguese settlement in India and, with British cooperation, achieved considerable success. In 1625, an Anglo-Dutch fleet defeated the Portuguese. The victors divided the spoils. In 1642, England abandoned the Dutch and became Portugal's ally. As reward, British merchants went and hampered trade facilities with all Portuguese possessions in Asia except Macau. 10 years later, Britain went to war with Holland in Europe and Anglo-Portuguese forces fought the Dutch in India. At the cessation of hostilities in 1654, Britain extended her power in India at Holland's expense. Wars, intrigues with Indian provincial warlords, and shrewd trading filled the coffers of the East India Company and enhanced its power. In the first half of the 17th century, England was importing cotton piece goods, indigo, drugs, black, sugar and carpet from India. Indian calicos were a special favorite with British housewives. In return, the company brought to India broadcloth, industrial metals and gold. In 1668, the company received from the British king the former Portuguese possession of Bombay with its magnificent undeveloped harbour. With royal assent, a similar British position was established on the eastern coast at Madras. Feuds between the Muslim or Mughal emperors of India and the warlike Maratha Hindus of south-central India, in the area centering on Pune, east of Bombay, enabled the company to proclaim the fusion of money-making and imperialism. It announced in December 1687 that it proposed to create such civil and military institutions as may be the foundation of a large, well-grounded, sure English dominion in India for all time to come. The accretion of British power moved with accelerated speed. The process was simple. Early in 1749, for instance, Prince Shaji, native potentate of the state of Tanjore, on the southeast coast, was dethroned by a rival. He offered the British a town called Avakodai in the place where the Koleroon River empties into the Bay of Bengal on condition, says the Cambridge History of India, of their helping him to recover the throne. After a few days of siege, Avakodai surrendered. The English kept it with the country belonging to it. And as for Shaji, the British Chronicle notes, no one thought of restoring him to his throne. Anybody wronged by the British was wooed by the French and vice versa. When Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, exploiting the disintegration of Mughal power at Delhi, took control of Bengal, the British tried to prevent him from getting too strong. In one indecisive skirmish he defeated a force of Europeans and imprisoned some of them overnight in the Black Hole of Calcutta, where an unknown number perished. But on January 2, 1757, a young British officer named Robert Clive retook Calcutta and forced Siraj-ud-Dowlah to accept humiliating terms. The Nawab accordingly conspired with the French. The British Admiral Watson thereupon threatened him. "They will kindle such a flame in your country," the Englishman wrote, "as all the water in the Ganges shall not be able to extinguish." Sobered by these hot words, the Muslim ruler shrank into a passivity that facilitated the expulsion of his French allies from strategic Bengal areas. But the Nawab remained, and so did some French advisors. An insurrection, coinciding conveniently with the British attack, enabled Colonel Clive with 800 English and 2,220 mercenary Indian troops to rout the Nawab's army of 50,000 at Plassey on June 23, 1757. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was executed and his rival, necessarily a complacent British puppet, replaced him. The entire province of Bengal was now a British colony. With a frankness born of impunity, Clive wrote to Robert Orme, "I am possessed of volumes of material for the continuation of your history, in which will appear fighting, tricks, chicanery, intrigues, politics and the Lord knows what." It was all politics. Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal, continued the policy of British expansion through armed force, enforced tributes and dynastic conspiracies. His trial in England, which lasted from February 1788 to April 1795, showed that the British administration in India was neither scrupulous nor incorruptible, nor concerned with the welfare of Indians. Gradually, by means mostly foul but considered normal in that age and place, the British established themselves throughout the length and breadth of the vast Indian subcontinent. In some areas, the East India Company ruled directly through its officials. Elsewhere it stood close behind the thrones of Hindu Maharajas and Muslim Nawabs who blindly subserved the politics of British empire building. The Portuguese had been confined to a few ports. The Dutch had been ousted. French power, though still considerable, was waning. In 1786, Mirabeau, the French revolutionary, urged the Russian Tsar to help France by invading India. Napoleon's offensive against Egypt was conceived as the first step towards the destruction of the British in India. When the Corsicans' campaign in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed, he wrote to Emperor Paul in St. Petersburg urging him to march on India and promising men and supplies. Paul agreed and sent instructions to General Orlov, a Taman of the Don Cossacks. "All the wealth of India will be yours as a reward for the expedition," he wrote. Russia would acquire treasure and commerce and strike the enemy in the heart. The enemy was Britain. "I am enclosing all the maps I have," the emperor added. "They go only to Kiev and the Oxus." Later, Paul sent another map by special courier. General Orlov, however, never got beyond the Urals. Paul was mysteriously murdered and the Russo-French alliance lapsed. But in a few years it was renewed, and when Napoleon met Paul's successor, Alexander I, at Tilsit in East Prussia in 1807, they planned an assault on India. There is a letter in the Russian archives penned by Napoleon to Alexander on February 2, 1808, in which the Corsican proposed the formation of a Russo-French army to conquer India. "England will be enslaved," Napoleon predicted. He promised Stockholm to Russia as a reward for her efforts against England in Asia. These were idle dreams. The French in India were soon limited to a few maritime dots, and when, in 1818, the British crushed the Great Maratha Empire in south-central India, the last organized challenge to British rule vanished. The rest was a clean-up operation. While India was being subjugated, the invention of the spinning jenny in 1764, Watt's perfected steam engine in 1768, and the power loom in 1785 were converting England into a maker and exporter of textiles. Indian cotton goods were no longer wanted in Britain. On the contrary, Britain exported textiles and other factory products to the people of India who, in 1800, numbered approximately 140 million. India's industries consequently languished. Indian treasure flowed to the British Isles as profit or plunder. Indian handicrafts suffered too. India was transformed into a purely agrarian country whose villages, overcrowded by the influx of unemployed townsmen, could not produce enough food. According to a British source, the deaths from famine in India between 1800 and 1825 were 1 million. Between 1825 and 1850, 400,000. Between 1850 and 1875, 5 million. And between 1875 and 1900, 15 million. Engineered by wit and violence, England's annexations in India in the latter part of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th left many disgruntled and dispossessed native rulers. British attempts to introduce law and order and an equitable system of taxation further irritated innumerable persons nursing innumerable wounds. Widespread economic stringency intensified the general unrest. Only a spark was needed to produce a flame. India had not yet become totally docile, nor had the British learned the technique, which they subsequently mastered, of firm yet smooth and barely visible administration. It was 1857, and a Hindu prophecy declared that on the centenary of the Battle of Plassey in 1757 British rule would perish. A war, officially called the Mutiny or the Sepoy Mutiny, broke out. The immediate impetus was the distribution among Indian troops of British-made cartridges, graced with cow or pig fat, which had to be bitten before being loaded into rifles. Since a Hindu must not touch cow fat and a Muslim must not touch pork, the provocation was perfect and Indian army units rebelled. But the British authorities admitted that the Bengal Indian force was a brotherhood closely identified with the hungry villages, and the same bond connected all sepoys in British uniform with the ragged, hungry peasants. Numerous regiments rose. One seized Delhi. Muslims took the lead, but all communities assiduously annulled innovations introduced by the British. Rail and telegraph lines were cut. Both sides committed numerous murders. Indian soldiers killed their British officers, and at Baynars, rebels, suspects and even disorderly boys, says the Cambridge History of India, were executed by infuriated officers and unofficial British residents who volunteered to serve as hangmen. Much blood also flowed in pitched battles and sieges. The mutiny was unplanned, uncoordinated, leaderless and hopeless. Inevitably, after many months, the British, aided by loyal Indians, suppressed it. With the restoration of peace, the East India Company, upon which, according to the Cambridge history, all parties in England agreed in throwing the blame of the mutiny, was abolished. In 1858, Queen Victoria assumed the government of India and appointed Lord Canning her first viceroy. For 89 years thereafter, until August 15, 1947, India was a colony of the British Empire. The blood and plunder period was ended. England's ideals of clean government filtered into the British administration of India. The British watered some deserts and improved communications. Many British officials, after 20 or 30 years' service in India, felt at home in India and like foreigners when they went home to England. They were devoted to India. They ate out their hearts and ruined their health coping with difficult problems. The British in India, however, were a fifth caste, the first caste. They interdined with Indians perfunctorily and intermarried seldom. The British were the super Brahmin Kshatriyas. All Indians were untouchables. The British were in India, never of India. They were like teachers who keep the class quiet and teach the children to read, write and reckon and to march in twos, but who do not really teach the children anything, nor help them, because they regard themselves as animal trainers and the children as nasty animals. The British were masters in somebody else's home. Their very presence was a humiliation. Despite the best intentions of the best among them, their every act was a humiliation. Then they complained, with pain, that Indians were ungrateful. The complaint was a measure of the lack of understanding. The British never deciphered the palimpsest, which is India. They merely read the inscription on the surface. India was a weak, dirty, backward country, with some fine monuments to be sure, and some superior brains, but generally inferior, and Asiatic. Even if the British had converted India into a land flowing with milk and honey, they would have been disliked. Imperialism, like dictatorship, sears the soul, degrades the spirit, and makes individuals small the better to rule them. Fear and cowardice are its allies. Imperialism is government of other people, by other people, and for other people. What the subjects gain, be it ever so great, is only the byproduct of efforts on behalf of a distant master. The requirements of British prestige hurt Indian pride. All the visible manifestations of the British regime, the ceremonial pomp, the isolated cantonments or villas where the British dwelt, and the use of English, told the Indians that they were a subject race. Subjection stimulated a desire for liberation. That is why colonial administration never is, and never can be, successful. History has known no good colonizers. Every empire digs its own grave. Imperialism is a perpetual insult, for it assumes that the outsider has the right to rule the insiders who cannot rule themselves. It is thus arrogant nationalism, and inevitably begets an opposing nationalism. Alien rule thwarts the native lovers of power. The British could never forget the mutiny. After all, Lord Linlithgow, the British Viceroy, said to me in 1942, "We are the occupying power." Ever since the mutiny we have hesitated to put arms into the hands of Indians. Decades after the mutiny, when the British were secure enough in their power to share it, the share of Indians was small. Real power, the authority to decide, appoint, recall and spend, lay with the British. No matter how high an Indian rose in the government service, he remained a British hireling. His power was not merely severely restricted. It lacked one of the sweetest concomitants of power, popularity. For the more the British trusted him, the more his own people rejected him. Unloved and unwanted, the British found it dangerous to arouse too many expectations of self-government and inconvenient to kill too many hopes for it. Hence, all the 89 years of British rule constitute a series of oscillations between bold promises and disappointing performances. When the Queen took over from the company in 1858, she announced that as far as may be Indians would be given responsible posts in government. But Lord Lytton, Viceroy from 1876 to 1880, wrote in a secret report, "Since I am writing confidentially, I do not hesitate to say that both the government of England and of India appear to me up to the present moment unable to answer satisfactorily the charge of having taken every means in their power of breaking to the heart the words of promise they have uttered to the ear. This was the complaint by a man who, unfettered by London, would have done better. But the Indians naturally regretted the breach of faith even more keenly than the Queen's first officer in India. When the demand for broader participation in local government and for redress of grievances grew more insistent, Lord Dufferin, Viceroy from 1884 to 1888, intending to direct upper-class discontent into an artificial canal, sired the Indian National Congress. Subsequent viceroys blessed it. Even if they had foreseen that a Callow-Indian law student in London in the late 1880s would make Congress an instrument of the downfall of British rule, they could not have helped themselves. The history of the British rule in India is a record of retreats, more graceful in some viscera quinquennium than in others, but always enhancing Indian strength. Torn between their political sagacity and their power lust, the British yielded as much of the appearance of power as circumstances required and as little of its substance as conditions permitted. Many times, for instance, Indians had been promised equality of employment in the ICs, Indian Civil Service, which was the British administration of India. After 82 years of equality, H.N. Brailsford remarked sarcastically, Englishmen held 95% of the posts in the ICs. In 1915. In 1923. He declares, using accepted figures, Indian participation was still only 10%. Jealous of her power, England feared the Indians. Conscious of their white skins and racial superiority, the British scorned the Indians. Fear, and the administrator's natural wish to administer with maximum facility, impelled the British to adopt the approved imperialistic tactic of divide and rule. Since the Muslims played the leading role in the mutiny and were thought to harbor dreams of empire, the British at first preferred the Hindus to the Muslims. When unrest and political ambitions stirred the Hindus, the British used the Muslims against the Hindus. 20th century, these royal instruments without political power numbered over 550. With that number of puppets the British thought they were secure. Professor Rushbrook Williams, a brilliant Englishman who often served as official intermediary with Indian princes, wrote in the London Evening Standard of May 28, 1930, the situations of these feudatory states, checkerboarding all India as they do, are a great safeguard. It is like establishing a vast network of friendly fortresses in debatable territory. It would be difficult for a general rebellion against the British to sweep India because of this network of powerful, loyal, native states. In 1939, India, with 3 times the population of the United States and 2/3 the area, had 41,134 miles of railway track, compared with 395,589 miles in the United States. India produced 2,500,000,000 kilowatt-hours of electric energy in 1935. The United States, 98,464,000,000 kilowatt-hours. These conditions were not the sole fault of the British. Indians shared the blame. But Indians blamed everything on the British. Indians delight in criticizing, and autocrats detest criticism. All opposition, writes Sir Valentine Kyrall, a British authority on India, even in the shape of criticism which it can treat as mere waste of breath, is distasteful to an autocracy and apartment to be regarded even as pregnant with sedition, and the British officials in India honestly believed in an autocratic form of government, though they tried to make it as paternal as possible. British paternalistic autocracy irritated some Indians and embittered others. Towards the end of the 19th century, Indian terrorists began to operate in Bengal and other areas. Terror invited repression which provoked more terror. One school of British politics wished to meet Indian hostility with blood and iron. A second school wished to mollify it with reforms. Each of these had its counterpart inside the Indian National Congress. The British autocrats did not help the Indian moderates. Late in the 19th century, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, well known in India, said, It is this consciousness of the inherent superiority of the European which has won us India. However well-educated and clever a native may be and however brave he may have proved himself, I believe that no rank which we can bestow upon him would cause him to be considered an equal by the British officer. Such racialism bred implacable enemies and embarrassed the moderates. The liberal lawyers, publicists and capitalists retained their control of Congress, but not everybody was in Congress. Boys were hurling bombs. Young men with degrees from Oxford and Cambridge were rejecting the West. East is East and West is West, and if the twain cannot meet, they said, it is because East was slave and West was master. In Toward Freedom, an autobiography, Jawaharlal Nehru writes that in 1907, at 17, when he had just gone to Cambridge from Harrow, he was an extremist. In fact, speaking of the Indian students, he says, almost without exception we were Tilakites or extremists. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, known as Lokmanya V or respected by the people V, played a key role in the development of the Indian independence movement and in Gandhi's life. Tilak was a high-degree Brahmin, a Kshatriya Brahmin, from Pune in the land of the Marathas, the last Indian folk to be conquered by the British. The Marathas are Highlanders who many times in their history descended into the lowlands, notably into Gandhi's homeland Gujarat, to dominate the less bellicose peoples of the plains. Once, these fighting Hindus captured Muslim Delhi. They remained foes of Islam. Tilak inaugurated an annual festival to celebrate King Shivaji, born 1627, died 1680, who brought new triumphs to the Maratha Empire. He wrote the most scholarly commentary on the Gita and defended every orthodox tenet and practice of Hinduism, including child marriage. He branded as a puppet an Indian who worked for the British. He exposed the emptiness of British concessions to Indian home rule aspirations. Tilak's fierce imprecations, the British charged, stirred a young Kshatriya Brahmin to assassinate a British official on June 27, 1897, the day of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and Tilak was condemned to 2 years in prison. Liberated before the end of his term, he resumed his Hindu religious agitation which, while aimed at the British, did not, to say the least, improve relations between Hindus and Muslims. Hindu passions continued to simmer. Indian nationalism found food in numerous events at home and abroad. The hollowness of British reforms nurtured it, and so did the Japanese defeat of the Russians in the 1904-05 war, the first time a colored nation defeated a white one, the 1905 Russian Revolution and the rise of the Young Turks. In 1904 Lord Curzon, considered by some the greatest viceroy of India, decreed the partition of the province of Bengal. This act may have been the beginning of the end of British rule in India. Indians always mention it as a British atrocity. Curzon, despite his monumental ability and industry, was a bureaucrat, autocrat and aristocrat. He lived close to his files and far from the people. Bengal had a population of over 70 million, and Curzon divided it the better to administer it. But the bisection was on religious lines. The Muslim area was separated from the more powerful Hindu area. Bitterness knew no restraint. Curzon was accused of anti-Hindu prejudice and of trying to put the Muslims under a debt which they would have to pay in the coin of submissiveness. These and similar charges were directed at Curzon until he left India towards the end of 1904. Bengal answered the partition with assassinations. In the land of the Marathas, Tilak whipped his followers into a frenzy. In both provinces British goods were boycotted. In both, Gandhi always found his most stubborn enemies. Gandhi and Tilak were opposites. Gandhi was a quiet public speaker, Tilak the consummate orator. Gandhi was wedded to non-violence. Tilak justified violence. Gandhi fostered Hindu-Muslim amity. Tilak favored Hindu supremacy. Gandhi respected means. Tilak pursued ends. Tilak's work bore bitter fruit. The 1906 annual session of Congress met in Calcutta, then the capital of India as well as of Bengal. It demanded a reversal of the partition, supported the anti-British boycott, and resolved in favor of self-government for India. Lord Minto, Curzon's successor, let it become known in 1906 that he was contemplating reforms which would give Indians a bigger voice in the provincial legislatures and more jobs in government offices. But the Tilak extremists were not mollified. Violence continued in Bengal and Maharashtra and spread to the Punjab. At the 1907 Congress session in Surat, moderates and extremists threw sandals at one another. After the fray, the Tilakites withdrew from the Congress, leaving the lawyers in control. The reforms drafted by Lord Minto, with the assistance of John Morley, Secretary of State for India in London, were introduced in 1908 and 1909. They extended Indian participation in the All-Indian and provincial legislative councils and in provincial executive councils as well. One Indian joined the Viceroy's Executive Council. But Morley made it clear, in the House of Lords debate in December 1908, that if it could be said that this chapter of reforms led directly or indirectly or necessarily up to the establishment of a parliamentary system in India, I, for one, would have nothing to do with it. More Indians sat on legislative councils and they talked more, but they had no more power, for the councils themselves had no power. Their function was consultative. Any joy which Indians might have derived from the Minto-Morley reforms was soured by a concomitant measure, the introduction of separate electorates. In 1906, a Muslim deputation led by the Aga Khan waited upon Lord Minto and urged that in all future elections Hindus vote for Hindu representatives and Muslims for Muslim representatives. Nationalist historians have branded this interview as a command performance rehearsed and conducted under Minto's baton. Whatever the facts, Minto and Morley granted the Muslim request, and in 1909, separate religious electorates, embellished with the device enabling Muslims to obtain more than their proportional number of seats, weightage, this was called, became a permanent Indian institution whose mischief was incalculable, for it made religious differences the decisive factor in every political contest. The central political problem in India was to bridge the gulf between Hindus and Muslims. This widened it. However, the first though not lasting effect of the separate electorates was to bring more Muslims into the Congress party. Prominent among them was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. In 1911, the new king, George V, and Queen Mary, visited India amid fantastic pomp. The king announced the removal of the capital to Delhi and the annulment of the partition of Bengal. Nevertheless, and though Tilak had been sentenced for sedition in November 1907 to a long term of imprisonment and was ailing in Mandalay, acts of personal terror continued. In 1912 Lord Hardinge, the viceroy, narrowly escaped death by a bomb. The outbreak of war in 1914 found some Indians loyal, some disloyal and few enthusiastic, but many ready to serve in the British Army. More than 500,000 Indians fought for England in France, Flanders, Palestine and on other fronts. Indian princes and commoners distinguished themselves in combat on the ground and in the air. Tilak had returned from exile in 1914 and pledged loyalty. Gandhi returned from South Africa, via London, in January 1915 and recruited for the British Army. But idleness and the Irish rebellion at Easter, 1916, were too much for Tilak's fiery spirit, and he burst forth into a passionate anti-British campaign in favor of Home Rule. His companion agitator, who if anything excelled him in oratory and vituperation, was Mrs. Annie Besant. They were vigorously assisted by Sir G. P. Ramaswamy Iyer and by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The Indian earth rumbled with the noise of the volcano beneath it. Not only the politicians, but the soldiers and even the peasants, felt that the blood Indians were shedding in Britain's battle should be recompensed. On August 20, 1917, accordingly, Edwin S. Montagu, Secretary of State for India, announced in the House of Commons that British policy envisaged not only the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration, but also the granting of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an NMG integral part of the British Empire. This was interpreted as being a pledge of dominion status. The Indian earth rumbled with the noise of the volcano beneath it. Not only the politicians, but the soldiers and even the peasants, felt that the blood Indians were shedding in Britain's battle should be recompensed. On August 20, 1917, accordingly, Edwin S. Montagu, Secretary of State for India, announced in the House of Commons that British policy envisaged not only the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration, but also the granting of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an NMG integral part of the British Empire. This was interpreted as being a pledge of dominion status. Tilak thought that on occasions it might be desirable to occupy positions of power within the state apparatus. He once sent Gandhi a check for 50,000 rupees as a bet that he could recruit 5,000 Marathas for the British Army if Gandhi extracted a promise from the Viceroy that some of the enlisted personnel would receive officers' commissions. Gandhi returned the check. He did not like betting, and he felt that if you do something you do it because you believe in it and not for what you hope to get out of it. The war closed victoriously in November 1918. Trouble did not wait long. It came early in 1919. Tilak had been interned again in August 1918. Mrs. Besant was also under arrest. Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali, brothers and powerful and prominent Muslim leaders, had been imprisoned during the war. Secret tribunals had been sentencing people in all parts of India. Many newspapers were muzzled by war-not-signed time censorship. These measures evoked great bitterness. But with the coming of peace, the country expected the restoration of civil liberties. Gandhi, just recuperating from dysentery and from an operation for fissures necessitated by it, decided that the impending government legislation was unjust, subversive of the principle of liberty and destructive of the elementary rights of individuals on which the safety of the community as a whole and of the state itself is based. Assuming that the bill would be enacted, Gandhi began preparations for civil resistance on the pattern of his victorious effort in South Africa. Though still so weak that somebody had to read his speeches, he traveled to many cities laying the groundwork for a gigantic, nationwide Satyagraha campaign designed to induce the government to withdraw the repressive legislation. Meanwhile, he appealed to the Viceroy by letter and through the press not to approve the law. On March 18, 1919, the Rowlatt Act became the law of the land. An electric shock ran through India. Was this the commencement of dominion status? Was this the reward for the bloodshed in the war? The next day, Mahatma Gandhi, who had come to Madras for a meeting, said to his host, C. Rajagopalachari, "Last night the idea came to me in a dream that we should call on the country to observe a general hardle. A hardle is a suspension of economic activity. Shopkeepers do not open for business, employees do not report for work, factories stay shut. Ships are not loaded or unloaded." Gandhi urged that Hardle Day be a day of fasting and prayer and of humiliation and prayer. Thereafter Satyagraha would unfold according to circumstances. Resistors might, for example, buy and sell proscribed books, or manufacture sold in contravention of the law which made its production a state monopoly. The Hardle was Gandhi's first act against the British government of India. Indeed, it was his first political act in India. His intervention on behalf of the champion sharecroppers had unintentionally involved him in friction with the British court. But now he deliberately appealed for a nationwide demonstration against the British authorities. It was the beginning of his 28 years of struggle against British rule in India. The end of the struggle was the end of British rule. Thanks for watching my video.